"Stand down, Private Chen. You're nothing but a liability to this unit." Commander Blake's voice thundered across the training ground as his hand struck hard across Lieutenant Maya Chen's face. The crack echoed through the morning air like a gunshot, and soldiers froze mid-drill, some snickering quietly at what they assumed was just another weak recruit getting put in her place. But when the 5 feet 4 inches Asian-American woman in the mud-stained combat uniform slowly turned back to face her superior officer with deadly calm and spoke just 4 quiet words, "Sir." That was unwise. Nobody could have predicted the catastrophic chain of events that would destroy a military career, expose a decades-long cover-up, and reveal that the seemingly fragile soldier they'd all dismissed was actually the most dangerous person on that entire base. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Fort Meridian Military Base sprawled across 15,000 acres of rolling hills in northern Montana, home to the 3rd Infantry Division's elite training programs. The October morning was crisp and clear, with frost still clinging to the edges of the obstacle course barriers. Companies Alpha through Delta were conducting their monthly combat readiness assessment, a grueling day-long evaluation that would determine promotions, assignments, and career trajectories for the 847 soldiers participating. Lieutenant Maya Chen stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulder-length black hair pulled back in regulation style and intelligent, dark brown eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her. To the casual observer, she appeared unremarkable among the sea of camouflaged uniforms, perhaps even fragile compared to the towering soldiers surrounding her. Her compact frame and quiet demeanor had earned her the nickname Mouse among some of the more vocal members of her unit, though never to her face. She carried herself with perfect military bearing, but there was something almost apologetic about her posture, as if she was constantly trying to take up less space. Her service record, visible to anyone who cared to look, showed a competent but unremarkable career trajectory. Graduated middle of her class from West Point, completed basic infantry training without distinction, served 2 routine deployments in non-combat roles. She had never received any major commendations, never been selected for special operations training, never shown any particular aptitude for leadership or tactical innovation. On paper, Lieutenant Maya Chen was exactly what she appeared to be, a dedicated but average soldier who followed orders, kept her head down, and blended seamlessly into the background. What her fellow soldiers saw during daily interactions only reinforced this impression. Maya rarely spoke unless directly addressed, never volunteered for high-profile assignments, and seemed genuinely uncomfortable with any form of attention or recognition. During training exercises, she performed adequately but never outshined her peers. In the mess hall, she sat quietly with a small group of equally unremarkable soldiers, discussing mundane topics like weekend plans and family news. Her quarters were neat and regulation compliant, decorated only with a few modest personal items, photos of what appeared to be civilian family members, a small collection of books on military history, and a single medal from a marksmanship competition at the Academy. The other soldiers had formed their opinions about her accordingly. Sergeant Rodriguez from Alpha Company often joked that Maya was the kind of officer who would spend her 20 years pushing papers and never see real combat. Corporal Washington had once commented that she seemed too nice for military life, more suited to being a teacher or social worker than a soldier. Even among the female soldiers on base, Maya was seen as someone who was trying hard, but simply lacked the aggressive edge necessary for military leadership. Commander Blake Harrison embodied everything that Maya apparently was not. At 6 feet 2 inches tall with broad shoulders and a commanding presence, he looked like he had stepped out of a military recruitment poster. His voice could be heard across parade grounds. His uniform was always immaculate, and his combat ribbons told the story of a distinguished career, spanning 3 decades and multiple combat deployments. He had earned his position through a combination of tactical brilliance, physical prowess, and the kind of aggressive leadership style that inspired both fear and respect among his subordinates. To his superiors, Commander Blake was the epitome of military excellence, a decorated veteran who had successfully trained thousands of soldiers and maintained one of the highest unit readiness ratings in the entire division. His methods were sometimes harsh, but results spoke for themselves. Soldiers who completed training under his command were consistently among the best prepared and most effective in combat situations. His reputation extended far beyond Fort Meridian. Junior officers across the military sought assignments under his command, knowing that his recommendation could make or break a career. But there were whispers too. Quiet conversations in barracks late at night, stories that were never officially recorded but circulated nonetheless. Some soldiers spoke of training sessions that crossed the line from tough discipline into something darker. Female soldiers in particular had learned to avoid being alone with Commander Blake, though none had ever filed formal complaints. The military's old boy network protected men like Blake, and everyone knew that accusations without ironclad proof were career suicide for the accusers. Maya had heard these whispers. Of course, in her 18 months at Fort Meridian, she had witnessed Blake's methods firsthand: the humiliation of soldiers who made minor mistakes, the physical corrections that bordered on assault, the way his eyes lingered too long on female soldiers during inspections. She had seen promising careers destroyed by his negative evaluations, watched good soldiers transfer to other units rather than endure his leadership style. But like everyone else, Maya had kept her observations to herself, maintaining the quiet, unassuming demeanor that had defined her military career. On this particular drill day, as Alpha Company formed up for combat exercises under the harsh Montana sun, none of the 200 soldiers present could have imagined that they were about to witness something that would be discussed in military circles for decades to come. They saw only what they had always seen: Commander Blake, the decorated war hero, and Lieutenant Maya Chen, the unremarkable mouse who would probably never amount to anything significant in the military hierarchy. But sometimes, the most dangerous people are those who have learned to hide in plain sight. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The October air at Fort Meridian carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, with temperatures hovering just above freezing as dawn broke over the sprawling military installation. Drill day had begun at 0500 hours, with the piercing wail of reveille echoing across the barracks, followed by the thunderous sound of 847 soldiers from 4 companies, moving in synchronized chaos toward the main training grounds. The massive complex stretched across 3 square miles of carefully maintained terrain, featuring everything from urban warfare simulation buildings to dense forest obstacle courses designed to push even the most elite soldiers to their breaking limits. Alpha Company had been assigned to Section 7, a particularly challenging area known among the troops as Hell's Kitchen, a nickname earned through years of grueling exercises that had broken the spirits of countless recruits. The terrain was deliberately unforgiving: steep hills covered in loose gravel that shifted treacherously underfoot, water obstacles filled with ice-cold runoff from the nearby mountains, and a series of concrete bunkers connected by narrow tunnels designed to simulate the claustrophobic conditions of urban combat. Everything about Section 7 was calculated to create stress, confusion, and the kind of pressure that revealed a soldier's true character under fire. As the 4 platoons of Alpha Company spread out across their assigned positions, the underlying tension that always accompanied drill day began to manifest in subtle but unmistakable ways. Veterans moved with the easy confidence of soldiers who had survived these evaluations many times before. Their equipment checks performed with automatic precision born of muscle memory. Newer recruits betrayed their nervousness through small tells, repeatedly adjusting their gear, checking and rechecking their weapons, stealing glances at their more experienced comrades for reassurance that rarely came. Lieutenant Maya Chen stood with 2nd Platoon near the eastern edge of the training area, her dark eyes systematically scanning the environment with what appeared to be casual interest but was actually something far more methodical. While her fellow soldiers focused on the obvious challenges ahead, the obstacle courses, the marksmanship ranges, the tactical scenarios they would need to complete, Maya's attention was drawn to details that others overlooked entirely. She noted the positioning of the observation towers where evaluators would be stationed, mentally calculating sight lines and blind spots. Her gaze lingered on the emergency communication stations scattered throughout the area, and she observed the patrol patterns of the military police units that provided security during large-scale exercises. To anyone watching, Maya appeared to be suffering from the same pre-exercise jitters as many of the younger soldiers. She shifted her weight from foot to foot, occasionally adjusting her equipment harness, and kept her eyes downcast in what seemed like nervous concentration. But there was something different in the quality of her attention, a systematic thoroughness that suggested her observations went far beyond mere anxiety. She was cataloging weaknesses in the security perimeter, identifying potential escape routes, and noting the precise locations of every camera and monitoring device within her field of vision. The morning briefing had been conducted by Commander Blake himself, delivered in his characteristic style that combined military precision with barely controlled aggression. He had outlined the day's objectives with the kind of detail that left no room for misinterpretation. 4 major exercise phases, each designed to test different aspects of combat readiness, with performance evaluations that would directly impact everything from leave privileges to promotion opportunities. His voice had carried clearly across the assembled troops. But Maya had noticed something that others missed, the slight tremor in his hands when he thought no one was looking, the way his eyes avoided direct contact with several of the female soldiers in the formation. As the companies dispersed to their respective training areas, Maya became aware of a subtle shift in the atmosphere around her. It wasn't anything dramatic enough to alarm the casual observer, but there were signs that suggested this particular drill day might be different from the routine evaluations that had preceded it. The military police presence seemed heavier than usual, with additional patrols positioned at strategic points throughout the training complex. The observation towers were manned by officers she didn't recognize, wearing uniforms that suggested they might be from outside Fort Meridian entirely. More troubling were the small behavioral changes she observed in Commander Blake's inner circle. The senior sergeants and staff officers who usually carried themselves with absolute confidence were displaying subtle signs of stress. Sergeant Major Williams, normally unflappable during even the most chaotic exercises, had been checking his radio more frequently than protocol required. Captain Torres, Blake's second-in-command, kept glancing toward the main administrative building as if expecting some kind of signal or message that hadn't yet arrived. Maya's heightened awareness of these details wasn't paranoia or overthinking. It was the result of training that went far deeper than anything reflected in her official military record. Every instinct honed through years of experience that couldn't be documented was telling her that the routine nature of this drill day was an illusion, that beneath the familiar rhythms of military exercise lay currents of tension that could turn dangerous without warning. The other soldiers in 2nd Platoon remained focused on immediate concerns, ensuring their equipment was properly secured, reviewing the tactical scenarios they'd been briefing on for weeks, engaging in the kind of nervous banter that helped ease pre-exercise tension. Private Jackson worried aloud about the marksmanship portion of the evaluation. knowing that his scores from the previous month had been barely adequate. Corporal Martinez discussed strategy for the team-based urban warfare simulation, analyzing different approaches they might take to complete their objectives within the allotted time, but Maya's attention had shifted to something else entirely. The way Commander Blake was moving through the various platoon positions, ostensibly conducting his normal pre-exercise inspections, but actually seeming to focus disproportionate attention on the female soldiers under his command. She watched as he spent extra time examining equipment carried by women who had previously reported problems with his leadership style, noted how his routine uniform inspections involved physical contact that served no legitimate military purpose, observed the barely concealed discomfort on faces of soldiers who had learned to endure his attention in silence. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the frost and casting long shadows across the training grounds. Radio chatter filled the air as various units coordinated their movements, and the steady sound of boots on gravel created a rhythm that was both familiar and oddly ominous. Everything appeared normal, routine, exactly as it should be during a standard military exercise, but Maya Chen knew better. Her carefully cultivated facade of unremarkable competence masked senses that had been trained to detect threats long before they became obvious to others. And as Commander Blake's voice boomed across the training area, calling for final equipment checks before the first exercise phase began, she felt the unmistakable certainty that before this day ended, the carefully maintained order of Fort Meridian was going to collapse in ways that no one, except perhaps her, was prepared to handle. The stage was set. The players were in position, and the woman everyone dismissed as harmless was about to discover just how catastrophically wrong they had been about everything they thought they knew. The first phase of drill day exercises began at 630 hours with the sharp blast of air horns echoing across section. 2nd Platoon had been assigned to the urban warfare simulation course, a maze of concrete buildings and narrow alleyways designed to replicate the conditions soldiers might face in hostile territory. As the platoon moved into position, Maya noticed Commander Blake positioning himself near the observation point that would give him the best view of their performance and, more importantly, the best opportunity to single out individual soldiers for his particular brand of motivational correction. The exercise scenario was straightforward. Clear 3 buildings of simulated enemy combatants while protecting civilian targets and maintaining unit cohesion. Maya's role was to provide rear security and coordinate communications, a position that typically kept junior officers out of the spotlight and away from the kind of dramatic heroics that attracted unwanted attention. It was exactly the kind of assignment that reinforced her reputation as a competent but unremarkable soldier. Content to handle supporting roles while others took the lead. As 2nd Platoon advanced through the first building, Maya executed her assigned duties with textbook precision. She maintained radio contact with the command post, called out tactical updates to her team members, and provided covering fire when necessary. Her movements were economical and professional, drawing no particular notice from the evaluators positioned around the training area. To anyone watching, Lieutenant Maya Chen was performing exactly as expected, adequately, safely, and without distinction. But when Private Sarah Mitchell, a 19-year-old from rural Nebraska who had joined the Army to escape an abusive home situation, stumbled while navigating a particularly challenging obstacle, Maya's carefully maintained facade began to show cracks. Mitchell had twisted her ankle and was struggling to keep up with the platoon's advance, clearly favoring her injured leg, but trying desperately not to show weakness. In the rigid hierarchy of military training, any sign of physical limitation could result in negative evaluations that might derail a promising career. Maya quickly moved to Mitchell's position, ostensibly to check on tactical positioning, but actually to assess the extent of the injury. "How bad is it?" she whispered, positioning herself so that her body blocked the view from the observation towers. "I can handle it." "Ma'am," Mitchell replied through gritted teeth, though her pale complexion and labored breathing suggested otherwise. "Just need to walk it off." Maya made a split-second decision that would later be analyzed and debated by military investigators. Instead of reporting the injury through proper channels, which would have resulted in Mitchell's immediate removal from the exercise and a negative evaluation that could impact her career, Maya quietly adjusted the platoon's formation to provide additional support for the injured soldier. She reassigned covering positions to take pressure off Mitchell's movement, modified their route through the remaining buildings to minimize the physical demands on the injured ankle, and maintained constant communication to ensure Mitchell could complete the exercise without compromising the unit's performance. The modifications were subtle enough that most of the evaluators didn't notice anything unusual. Second platoon completed their assigned objectives within the allotted time frame. All team members remained safe and accounted for, and their overall performance met the standards expected for their experience level. Maya's after-action report noted no significant incidents or personnel issues, and Private Mitchell successfully concealed the extent of her injury until medical attention could be sought privately after the exercise concluded. But Commander Blake had been watching more closely than Maya, realized as second platoon regrouped for debriefing. Blake approached their position with the predatory stride that experienced soldiers had learned to recognize and fear. His eyes were fixed on Maya with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he had observed something that displeased him. The other platoon members instinctively stepped back, creating space for what everyone assumed would be a routine but unpleasant interaction between a demanding commander and a subordinate who had somehow fallen short of expectations. "Lieutenant Chen." Blake's voice carried the deceptively calm tone that preceded his most explosive outbursts. "Interesting tactical decisions during that exercise. Care to explain why you modified the assigned formation without authorization?" Maya maintained perfect military bearing, her expression neutral and professional. "Sir, I made minor adjustments to optimize team performance based on real-time battlefield conditions. All primary objectives were achieved within specified parameters. Minor adjustments?" Blake stepped closer, his 6'2" frame towering over Maya's compact stature. "You compromised unit integrity to accommodate a soldier who was clearly unfit for duty. That's not leadership, Lieutenant. That's weakness." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Maya could feel the eyes of her fellow soldiers watching the confrontation, waiting to see how she would respond to Blake's aggressive questioning. Most junior officers in her position would have accepted the criticism, offered appropriate apologies, and moved on to avoid further confrontation. That was the safe play, the smart career move, the response that Blake expected from someone of Maya's apparent temperament and experience level. Instead, Maya held Blake's gaze with steady composure that seemed to surprise him. "Sir, with respect, ensuring that all team members can contribute effectively to mission success is a fundamental aspect of tactical leadership." Private Mitchell remained mission-capable throughout the exercise, and our unit achieved all assigned objectives. Blake's face began to redden, a warning sign that everyone in second platoon recognized immediately. When Commander Blake started to flush with anger, smart soldiers found reasons to be somewhere else quickly. But Maya stood her ground, maintaining the kind of calm professionalism that somehow made Blake's aggressive posturing seem excessive and inappropriate. "Are you questioning my evaluation of this exercise, Lieutenant?" Blake's voice had risen enough to attract attention from nearby units. "Because it sounds like you think you know better than a decorated combat veteran with 30 years of experience." "Not at all, sir. I'm simply providing my tactical assessment of the decisions made during the exercise." Maya's response was delivered in the same measured tone. But there was something underneath it now, a hint of steel that hadn't been there before. Blake stepped even closer, now clearly violating Maya's personal space in a way that would have been considered inappropriate between any superior and subordinate, but was especially problematic given the gender dynamics involved. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper that only Maya and the nearest soldiers could hear clearly. "You think you're clever, don't you, Chun? Think you can hide behind regulations and procedure manuals while real soldiers do the hard work. But I see what you really are, just another quota hire who doesn't belong in uniform." The insult was calculated to provoke a reaction that would justify escalation. Blake had used similar tactics countless times before, pushing subordinates until they responded inappropriately, then using their emotional reactions to justify disciplinary action that could effectively end careers. It was a sophisticated form of bullying that exploited the military's emphasis on emotional control and respect for authority. But Maya's response wasn't what Blake expected. Instead of anger or defensive justification, she simply nodded acknowledgement and responded in the same professional tone she had maintained throughout the confrontation. "I understand your assessment, sir. Is there anything else regarding the exercise performance that requires clarification?" Her composure seemed to infuriate Blake even further. He had expected anger, defensiveness, or at least some sign that his attack had found its mark. Instead, Maya's unflappable professionalism made his aggressive behavior appear unprovoked and inappropriate. Several soldiers in the immediate area were now watching the confrontation with obvious discomfort, clearly recognizing that their commander's conduct had crossed lines that had nothing to do with legitimate military evaluation. Blake's frustration reached a breaking point. In front of witnesses from multiple units, with evaluators and senior officers within earshot, he made the decision that would ultimately destroy his career and reveal truths that had been carefully hidden for decades. "You want to play games, Lieutenant? Let's see how well you handle real pressure." The threat was delivered with unmistakable menace, and everyone present understood that this confrontation had moved far beyond any legitimate military purpose. Maya had tried to help an injured soldier, defended her tactical decisions with appropriate professionalism, and maintained perfect military bearing throughout an increasingly inappropriate encounter. Now she was about to discover just how far Commander Blake was willing to go to assert his dominance over a subordinate who had refused to be intimidated. And Blake was about to learn that he had chosen the wrong target for his aggression. The tension from Blake's veiled threat hung heavy in the crisp Montana air as 2nd Platoon was dismissed to their next training rotation. Maya maintained her composed demeanor as she gathered her equipment, but several observant soldiers noticed the way her movements had become more deliberate, more controlled, like someone preparing for conflict rather than routine military exercises. The confrontation had drawn uncomfortable attention from other units, and word was already spreading through the informal communication networks that connected every corner of Fort Meridian. By 0800 hours, Maya found herself assigned to the live-fire marksmanship range, a concrete and steel facility built into the hillside, where soldiers tested their weapons proficiency under increasingly challenging conditions. The range featured targets at distances from 50 to 800 meters, with advanced scenarios including moving targets, low-light conditions, and simulated combat stress designed to replicate battlefield conditions. It was here that Blake chose to escalate his campaign of intimidation into something far more dangerous. Maya had been positioned at Station 12, somewhat isolated from the main cluster of firing positions where most of 2nd Platoon was conducting their qualifications. The assignment appeared routine, a standard marksmanship evaluation that would contribute to her overall drill day score, but the location had been specifically chosen to Provide Blake with the privacy he needed for his next move. The nearest soldiers were over 100 meters away, focused on their own shooting exercises and unable to clearly observe what was happening at Maya's position. As Maya prepared her M4 carbine for the qualification course, methodically checking her ammunition and adjusting her equipment with the practiced efficiency of someone thoroughly familiar with weapons handling, Blake approached her station accompanied by Staff Sergeant Morrison, one of his most loyal subordinates. Morrison was a 20-year veteran whose unwavering loyalty to Blake had been purchased through a combination of favorable assignments and willful blindness to his commander's more questionable practices. "Lieutenant Chen," Blake announced as he positioned himself directly behind her firing position, "I've decided to personally oversee your marksmanship evaluation today. Given your earlier performance, I want to ensure we get an accurate assessment of your capabilities under pressure." The statement was delivered loudly enough for nearby soldiers to hear, establishing an official pretext for his presence while simultaneously suggesting that Maya's previous performance had been somehow deficient. It was a masterful piece of psychological manipulation designed to undermine her confidence, while providing cover for whatever Blake had planned next. Maya acknowledged the announcement with a crisp, "Yes, sir," and continued her preparation routine. But she was acutely aware of the threat that Blake's presence represented. In her peripheral vision, she could see Morrison positioning himself at an angle that would block the view from the range control tower, while Blake moved to a position where he could interact with her without being clearly observed by other personnel. The first phase of the marksmanship course proceeded normally. Maya engaged targets at 50 and 100 meters with steady, controlled fire that produced respectable, if unremarkable, results. Her shooting was technically proficient, but deliberately restrained, good enough to meet qualification standards without displaying the kind of exceptional skill that might draw unwanted attention. To the casual observer, Lieutenant Maya Chen was performing exactly as expected for an officer with her apparent level of training and experience. But Blake wasn't satisfied with normal. As Maya prepared for the more challenging long-distance portions of the course, he began a campaign of deliberate interference designed to disrupt her concentration and create opportunities for the kind of hands-on correction that had become his signature method of asserting dominance over female soldiers. "Your stance is wrong, Lieutenant," Blake announced, stepping closer to Maya's position. "You're not going to hit anything shooting like that." Without waiting for permission or acknowledgement, Blake moved directly behind Maya and placed his hands on her shoulders, ostensibly to adjust her firing position, but actually applying pressure that forced her to shift her balance and compromise her stability. His touch lingered longer than any legitimate correction would require, and his proximity violated every standard of appropriate professional interaction between military personnel. "Sir, my position is within acceptable parameters," Maya responded evenly, attempting to step away from Blake's unwanted contact while maintaining the respectful tone required when addressing a superior officer. "Don't argue with me, Chen." Blake's voice had taken on the dangerous edge that warned of impending explosion. "I've been shooting expert since before you were born. You'll adjust your position as directed, or you'll fail this portion of the evaluation." The threat was delivered while Blake maintained physical contact that made Maya's skin crawl. His hands had moved from her shoulders to her waist, supposedly to adjust her stance, but clearly designed to assert his power and test her willingness to endure inappropriate behavior in silence. Morrison watched from his position nearby, his expression carefully neutral but his body language suggesting complete readiness to support whatever Blake chose to do next. Maya found herself trapped in a situation that had become all too familiar for female soldiers throughout military history. Reporting Blake's behavior would require her to file formal complaints against a decorated superior officer. Accusations that would likely be dismissed or covered up while destroying her own career in the process. Accepting his inappropriate conduct in silence would only encourage further escalation while compromising her own integrity and self-respect. As Blake's hands continued their unwelcome exploration under the guise of training correction, Maya made a decision that would later be analyzed by military investigators, legal experts, and ethical review boards. Instead of choosing between the traditional options of silent endurance or career-destroying resistance, she opted for a third path that would expose Blake's true nature while maintaining plausible deniability about her own capabilities. "Sir," Maya said in a voice that carried clearly across the firing range, "I believe I understand the correct position now. Would you prefer that I demonstrate my marksmanship skills with the current target configuration, or should I engage the more challenging scenarios?" The question seemed innocuous enough, a subordinate officer seeking clarification about exercise parameters, but Maya had deliberately raised her voice to ensure that other soldiers would hear the exchange. More importantly, she had phrased her response in a way that would force Blake to either withdraw his inappropriate behavior or escalate it in front of witnesses. Blake's face flushed with anger as he realized that Maya had maneuvered him into a position where his continued harassment would be clearly visible to other personnel. His hands dropped away from her body, but the fury in his eyes promised that this confrontation was far from over. "You think you're clever, don't you, Chen?" Blake's voice was now loud enough to attract attention from soldiers at nearby firing positions. "You think you can manipulate the situation with your little word games. But I see right through you." The accusation was delivered with such venom that soldiers within earshot began to turn their attention towards Station 12. Sensing that something significant was happening but not yet understanding the full scope of the confrontation they were witnessing, Maya maintained her professional composure. But there was something different in her posture now, a subtle shift that suggested coiled energy waiting to be released. "Sir, I'm simply trying to complete the assigned marksmanship evaluation to the best of my ability. If my performance or conduct has been unsatisfactory, I'm prepared to accept appropriate feedback." Her response was flawlessly military in its correctness, but Blake heard something underneath it that made his anger explode into rage. Perhaps it was the absolute lack of fear in her voice, or the way she seemed to be controlling the tempo of their interaction, despite his superior rank and aggressive behavior. Whatever the trigger, Blake's next action would cross every line of military professionalism and reveal the true nature of his character to everyone present. As Maya turned back toward the firing range to continue her qualification, Blake grabbed her arm with enough force to spin her on to face him. The movement was violent and unmistakably aggressive, clearly visible to dozens of soldiers who had now stopped their own activities to watch the confrontation unfold. "You will show proper respect when I'm speaking to you, Lieutenant," Blake snarled, his grip on Maya's arm tightening to a level that would certainly leave bruises. "Or you'll learn what real consequences look like." The threat hung in the air like a challenge. Maya looked down at Blake's hand gripping her arm, then back up at his face with an expression that seemed almost curious, as if she was studying some interesting but dangerous specimen. And for the first time since the confrontation began, she smiled. That smile changed everything. It wasn't the nervous, placating expression that Blake had learned to expect from subordinates under pressure, nor was it the defiant smirk that would have justified immediate disciplinary action. Instead, Maya's smile carried a quality that made several observing soldiers instinctively step backward, a cold, calculating expression that suggested she knew something that Blake didn't, something that would fundamentally alter the balance of power between them. Blake's grip on Maya's arm tightened reflexively as he registered the unexpected response. In his 30 years of military service, he had perfected the art of intimidation through a careful combination of psychological pressure and physical dominance. Subordinates were supposed to show fear, anger, or submission when confronted with his aggressive tactics. They weren't supposed to smile with the kind of predatory calm that Maya was displaying. "Something funny, Lieutenant?" Blake's voice carried a dangerous undertone as he pulled Maya closer, his 6'2" frame looming over her, in a display of physical intimidation that had broken the spirit of countless soldiers before her. "Because I don't see anything amusing about your insubordinate attitude." Maya's dark eyes remained fixed on Blake's face with an intensity that made him increasingly uncomfortable. She didn't struggle against his grip or attempt to pull away, but there was something in her stillness that suggested coiled energy waiting for the right moment to be released. When she spoke, her voice carried a new quality, no longer the deferential tone of a junior officer, but something far more controlled and infinitely more dangerous. "Sir, you currently have approximately 15 seconds to release my arm, and step back to an appropriate distance before this situation becomes irreversible for both of us." The words were delivered with such calm certainty that Blake actually hesitated, momentarily confused by the complete transformation in Maya's demeanor. Around them, the normal sounds of the firing range had gradually diminished as more soldiers became aware that something significant was happening at Station 12. The crack of rifle fire continued from the more distant positions, but the immediate area had fallen into an expectant silence that suggested everyone present sensed they were witnessing something extraordinary. Staff Sergeant Morrison shifted nervously beside Blake, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm as his training kicked in. Something fundamental had changed in the dynamics of the confrontation, and Morrison's experience warned him that the situation was spiraling beyond Blake's control. But his loyalty to his commander prevented him from taking any action that might undermine Blake's authority, even as every tactical instinct screamed that they were moving into dangerous territory. Blake's response to Maya's warning was exactly what she had expected, an escalation driven by wounded pride and the need to reassert dominance in front of witnesses. Instead of releasing her arm, he tightened his grip further and used his superior size to force Maya backward against the concrete barrier that separated firing positions. The movement was clearly aggressive, unmistakably intended to intimidate through physical dominance, and visible to every soldier within a 100-meter radius. "You don't give me ultimatums, Lieutenant," Blake snarled, his face now inches from Maya's. "You follow orders, show proper respect, and accept whatever correction I deem necessary. And if you don't like it, you can explain your attitude to a court-martial board." Maya's smile widened slightly, and when she spoke, her voice carried a tone of almost conversational interest. "Sir, are you familiar with Article 128 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, completely disconnected from the physical confrontation that was unfolding. Blake's confusion was evident as he tried to process why Maya would be citing military law, while he was in the process of physically dominating her. Around them, the more experienced soldiers began to exchange glances, sensing that Maya's seemingly random reference to military regulations might be more significant than it appeared. "What the hell are you talking about, Chen?" Blake demanded, his grip on her arm remaining firm while his free hand moved to her shoulder in a gesture that was part intimidation and part inappropriate. "Contact. Article 128 covers assault charges under military law," Maya explained with the patient tone of someone delivering a lecture. "Specifically, it defines assault as an unlawful demonstration of violence, coupled with a present ability and apparent intent to do immediate bodily harm. The penalties can include court-martial, reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and dismissal from service." Blake's face flushed even redder as he realized that Maya was essentially accusing him of assault, while he was actively engaged in the behavior she was describing. But rather than backing down, his anger drove him to further escalation, exactly the response that Maya had been counting on. "Are you threatening me with legal action, Lieutenant?" Blake's voice had risen to a level that ensured everyone in the immediate area could hear every word. "Because that sounds like insubordination to me. And I have witnesses who will testify that you've been disrespectful and uncooperative throughout this entire interaction." Maya's eyes flicked briefly toward the soldiers who had gathered to watch the confrontation, noting their positions and expressions with the kind of tactical awareness that suggested she was operating from a completely different level of training than her official record indicated. When her gaze returned to Blake, there was something almost pitying in her expression. "Sir, I'm not threatening anything. I'm simply providing educational information about military law. However, since you mentioned witnesses, I should point out that approximately 37 soldiers are currently observing this interaction, including Staff Sergeant Kim from the Military Police Detachment, Sergeant Rodriguez, who has been recording training exercises for evaluation purposes, and Captain Williams from the Judge Advocate General's office, who happened to be conducting a routine inspection of the firing range." Blake's head turned involuntarily as he registered the accuracy of Maya's assessment. Indeed, the confrontation had drawn a significant crowd of observers, including several personnel whose presence would make any official inquiry far more complicated than Blake had anticipated. But more disturbing was the realization that Maya had been tracking the identities and positions of everyone present with a profound level of situational awareness that went far beyond anything a junior infantry officer should possess. "How do you," Blake began, but Maya smoothly interrupted him. "Sir, I would estimate that you now have approximately 8 seconds to release my arm and step back before the consequences of this situation become permanent and irreversible. Not for me, but for you." The countdown was delivered with such calm certainty that Blake actually found himself loosening his grip slightly, some primitive survival instinct warning him that he was approaching a line that he didn't fully understand. But his pride and 30 years of successfully intimidating subordinates overrode his caution, driving him to make the decision that would ultimately destroy his career and expose secrets that had been carefully hidden for decades. Instead of stepping back, Blake moved closer, using his superior size and strength to pin Maya more firmly against the concrete barrier. His face was now so close to hers that his breath was warm on her skin as he delivered what he intended to be the final word in their confrontation. "You don't scare me. Chun, you're nothing but a mouthy little girl playing soldier. And it's time someone taught you your place in the real military." Blake's free hand moved to Maya's throat in a gesture that was unmistakably threatening, crossing every possible line of appropriate conduct between military personnel. Around them, the silence became absolute as witnesses realized they were observing what appeared to be an assault by a senior officer against a subordinate. Maya looked up at Blake with an expression of almost scientific curiosity, as if she was studying the final moments before a carefully planned experiment reached its conclusion. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence that surrounded them, every word carried clearly to the assembled witnesses. "Sir, your time is up." And then Lieutenant Maya Chen, the unremarkable junior officer who had spent 18 months being dismissed as harmless and inconsequential, demonstrated exactly why that assessment had been so catastrophically wrong. What happened next occurred so quickly that most witnesses would later struggle to provide coherent accounts to the investigators who interviewed them. One moment, Commander Blake was using his superior size and position to physically dominate Lieutenant Maya Chen against the concrete barrier, his hand at her throat in an unmistakable gesture of violence. The next moment, Blake was face down on the ground with his arm twisted behind his back at an angle that suggested imminent dislocation, while Maya knelt beside him with one knee pressed firmly against his spine and her voice cutting through the stunned silence with military precision. "Staff Sergeant Morrison, step back and keep your hands visible," Maya commanded without taking her eyes off Blake, who was groaning in pain and confusion beneath her. "Captain Williams, please contact base security and request immediate response to the firing range. We have an incident requiring official documentation and medical evaluation." The transformation was so complete and so sudden that several soldiers later admitted they initially thought they were witnessing some kind of training demonstration. The quiet, unassuming Lieutenant Chen had vanished entirely, replaced by someone who moved with the fluid precision of a combatives expert and spoke with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command in high-stress situations. Morrison's hand had indeed moved toward his sidearm when he saw his commander go down, but something in Maya's tone froze him in place. There was a quality to her voice that transcended rank and protocol, the kind of absolute certainty that experienced soldiers recognized as the sound of someone operating from a level of training and expertise that commanded instant respect regardless of uniform insignia. "Ma'am, I need you to release Commander Blake immediately," Morrison managed, his voice betraying uncertainty despite his attempt to assert authority. "This is assault on a superior officer, and I'm authorized to use force to—" "Staff Sergeant," Maya interrupted, her voice remaining calm but carrying an edge that made Morrison's training whisper warnings about engaging an opponent whose capabilities he didn't understand. "You are currently observing the lawful restraint of an ANCO individual who committed assault under Article 128 of the UCMJ. I strongly advise you to document this incident accurately rather than compounding the legal complications through inappropriate intervention." Blake was attempting to struggle against Maya's hold, his face purple with rage and humiliation as he realized that his physical intimidation had been turned against him with embarrassing ease. But every movement he made only seemed to increase the pressure on his twisted arm, and Maya's positioning gave her complete control over his ability to move or speak clearly. "Get off me, you psychotic." Blake's furious words were cut short as Maya applied pressure that sent lightning bolts of pain through his shoulder and reminded him that his current position made threats somewhat inadvisable. "Sir," Maya said with the same patient tone she might use to explain tactical procedures to a confused recruit, "I'm going to need you to remain still and quiet while we wait for the appropriate authorities to arrive. Any aggressive movement or threatening language will be interpreted as continued hostile intent and responded to accordingly." Captain Williams, the JAG officer whose presence Maya had noted earlier, was already speaking rapidly into his radio while moving toward their position. His expression showed the kind of careful neutrality that legal officers maintained when witnessing events that would undoubtedly result in complex investigations and formal proceedings. Around them, the circle of witnesses had grown to include soldiers from multiple units who had been drawn by the commotion. The normal sounds of the firing range had ceased entirely as word spread that something extraordinary was happening at Station 12. Some soldiers were recording the incident on their phones, despite regulations against unauthorized photography, while others maintained the kind of respectful distance that suggested they understood they were witnessing something significant. Sergeant Rodriguez, whom Maya had identified as someone recording training exercises, was indeed capturing the entire incident on official documentation equipment. His camera had been running throughout the confrontation, providing an unbiased record of Blake's increasingly aggressive behavior and Maya's professional restraint right up until the moment when Blake's assault had triggered her defensive response. "Base security is en route," Captain Williams announced as he approached their position. ETA 3 minutes. Lieutenant Chen, can you provide a preliminary report on what occurred here? Maya's response was delivered in the crisp, precise language of someone thoroughly familiar with military reporting procedures. At approximately 0847 hours, Commander Blake initiated unauthorized physical contact during a routine marksmanship evaluation. When I requested that he maintain appropriate professional distance, he escalated to aggressive physical restraint and made verbal threats. His hand placement on my throat constituted assault under military law, triggering my defensive response. Blake attempted to protest from his position on the ground, but his words were largely incoherent due to his awkward position and overwhelming fury. What was clear to everyone present was that his version of events would need to explain how a decorated combat veteran with significant size and strength advantages had ended up helplessly restrained by a junior officer who officially had no specialized combat training. Captain Williams nodded as he took notes, his legal training allowing him to recognize the careful precision of Maya's language. She had provided just enough detail to establish the legal justification for her actions without revealing anything about the methods or training that had enabled her to neutralize a larger, stronger opponent with such devastating efficiency. Lieutenant, Williams continued, I'll need to advise you that this incident will require a formal investigation. You'll want to consider whether you need legal representation before providing detailed statements. Maya's response revealed another layer of her hidden capabilities. Sir, I'm familiar with Article 31 rights under the UCMJ. I waive representation for preliminary statements but reserve the right to counsel for formal proceedings. I'm prepared to provide a complete account of events leading to Commander Blake's assault and my defensive response. The casual reference to her legal rights suggested familiarity with military law that went well beyond what any infantry officer would typically possess. Williams raised an eyebrow but said nothing, making notes that would later become part of a much larger investigation into Lieutenant Maya Chen's background and qualifications. The sound of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of base security, followed shortly by medical personnel who would evaluate Blake's condition and document any injuries resulting from the incident. As the official response machinery began to engage, Maya maintained her position and her calm professional demeanor, but soldiers close enough to observe her carefully noticed subtle details that suggested her background was far more complex than anyone had realized. Sergeant Morrison had stepped back as directed, but his expression showed the confusion of someone whose worldview had been fundamentally challenged. He had served under Blake for over 5 years, watching his commander intimidate and dominate countless subordinates through aggressive tactics that had never been challenged or reported. The idea that Blake could be physically overpowered by anyone, let alone a small female officer, contradicted everything Morrison thought he understood about military hierarchy and personal combat effectiveness. As base security personnel took control of the scene and began separating witnesses for individual interviews, Maya finally released her hold on Blake and stepped back to allow medical evaluation. Blake's first action upon regaining his freedom was to surge to his feet in a rage that made his earlier anger seem mild by comparison. I want that officer arrested immediately. Blake roared at the security personnel, his voice carrying across the firing range with enough volume to be heard by soldiers hundreds of meters away. She assaulted a superior officer. I want charges filed for insubordination, assault, and conduct unbecoming. But something in the expressions of the responding personnel suggested that Blake's demands might not receive the immediate compliance he expected. The security team leader, Master Sergeant Kelly, had been briefing with Captain Williams and reviewing the preliminary witness statements while the medical team examined Blake's minor injuries when Kelly approached Blake to begin the formal documentation process. His first words indicated that the investigation might not proceed exactly as Blake anticipated. "Commander Blake, you're going to need to accompany us to headquarters for questioning regarding allegations of assault under Article 128 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You have the right to remain silent." As Blake's face went white with shock and rage, Maya stood quietly nearby. Her expression neutral and professional, while internally she calculated the cascading consequences that would flow from this moment. The carefully constructed facade that had protected her true identity for 18 months was about to be stripped away. But that was a price she had always been prepared to pay when the right moment arrived. And as Blake was led away in restraints, ranting about conspiracies and false accusations, none of the witnesses could have guessed that they had just observed the opening move in an investigation that would expose corruption reaching to the highest levels of Fort Meridian's command structure. The mouse had finally roared, and the sound would echo through the military establishment for years to come. The investigation room at Fort Meridian's headquarters building was sterile and windowless, furnished with nothing more than a metal table, 3 chairs, and recording equipment that hummed quietly in the background. Maya sat across from Colonel Patricia Reeves, the base's senior investigating officer, and Major David Kim from the Criminal Investigation Division. What should have been a routine interview following a physical altercation had evolved into something far more complex when preliminary background checks on Lieutenant Maya Chen had produced results that made no sense whatsoever. "Lieutenant Chen," Colonel Reeves began, consulting a thick folder that had materialized from sources she wasn't entirely cleared to discuss. "We need to talk about some inconsistencies in your service record that have come to light during our investigation." Maya's expression remained neutral, but something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle straightening that suggested she had been expecting this moment for some time. "Yes, ma'am. I'm prepared to provide clarification on any questions regarding my background or qualifications." Major Kim leaned forward, his own confusion evident as he referenced documents that seemed to contradict everything they thought they knew about the junior officer sitting across from them. "According to your official personnel file, you graduated from West Point with an unremarkable academic record, completed basic infantry training, and have served in routine administrative and support roles for the past 6 years. Is that accurate?" "That information is consistent with my standard service documentation, yes, sir." The careful phrasing of Maya's response didn't escape Colonel Reeves' attention. "Your standard documentation? Lieutenant, are you suggesting there might be non-standard documentation that tells a different story?" Maya was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes studying the 2 officers across from her with an intensity that made them both increasingly uncomfortable. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a new quality, no longer the deferential tone of a junior officer, but something that suggested years of experience operating at levels far above her apparent rank. "Ma'am, before I answer that question, I need to understand the scope and classification level of this investigation. Are we discussing a simple assault case, or has this inquiry been elevated to address matters of national security clearance and special operations background verification?" The question hit the room like a physical force. Colonel Reeves and Major Kim exchanged glances that suggested Maya's response had confirmed suspicions they were only beginning to understand. Kim consulted his notes again, his expression showing the frustration of someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "Lieutenant, 3 hours ago we ran your social security number through standard military databases and got normal results. When we escalated to Department of Defense classification systems, we found records that have been sealed under executive authority. When we requested access through appropriate channels, we were told that any inquiry regarding Maya Elizabeth Chen would be forwarded to a Pentagon office that doesn't officially exist. Maya nodded as if this was exactly what she had expected to hear. And what did that office tell you? They didn't, Colonel Reeves said, her voice tight with the kind of frustration that senior officers experience when they discover that their authority has limits they weren't aware of. Instead, we received a phone call from a General Morrison at the Pentagon who asked us to hold Lieutenant Chen for interview by personnel, who would arrive within 6 hours. When we asked about the nature of the inquiry, we were told it was classified above our clearance level. General Morrison, Maya repeated, and for the first time since the interview began. Something like emotion flickered across her features, though whether it was relief, concern, or something else entirely was impossible to determine. That would be General Patricia Morrison, Deputy Director of Defense Intelligence Operations. The fact that Maya not only recognized the name, but could provide the correct title and gender, stopped both investigators cold. Major Kim set down his pen and stared directly at Maya, with the expression of someone who had just realized that everything he thought he understood about the situation had been wrong from the beginning. Lieutenant Chen, Kim said slowly, who exactly are you? Maya's response was delivered with the kind of calm precision that suggested she had rehearsed this moment many times in her mind. My name is Maya Elizabeth Chen. I hold the rank of lieutenant in the United States Army, assigned to Fort Meridian under Special Operations Cover Protocols. My actual military occupational specialty and operational background are classified at levels requiring presidential authorization for disclosure. The silence that followed was broken only by the quiet hum of the recording equipment. Colonel Reeves found her voice first, though it carried a note of uncertainty that suggested she was operating in territory well beyond her normal experience. Are you telling us that your entire assignment to Fort Meridian has been some kind of undercover operation? I'm telling you that my presence here serves purposes beyond those reflected in my official personnel file. Maya replied carefully. The specific nature and objectives of those purposes are classified. Information that I cannot discuss without proper authorization from the appropriate oversight authorities. Major. Kim was frantically taking notes, trying to document a conversation that seemed to be revealing new layers of complexity with every exchange. And Commander Blake? Was his behavior part of whatever investigation you're conducting? Maya's expression hardened slightly at the mention of Blake's name. Commander Blake's conduct was not part of any planned operation. His assault against me was an unscheduled incident that required immediate defensive response. However, his behavior patterns and the institutional failures that have allowed them to continue are indeed relevant to ongoing investigations. The implication hung in the air like a challenge. Colonel Reeves leaned back in her chair, processing the possibility that a junior officer under her command had been conducting classified investigations into her own personnel without her knowledge or authorization. Lieutenant, are you suggesting that there are systemic problems at Fort Meridian that have warranted Pentagon-level investigation? Ma'am, I'm suggesting that when General Morrison arrives, she will be in a position to provide briefings on matters that are currently beyond my authorization to discuss. What I can tell you is that today's incident with Commander Blake represents the culmination of an 18-month observation period during which certain patterns of behavior and institutional responses have been carefully documented. Major. Kim stopped writing and looked up at Maya with an expression of dawning comprehension. You've been watching us, all of us, for 18 months. I've been performing duties consistent with my actual training and operational specialty, Maya confirmed. Those duties required maintaining a cover identity that would allow me to observe and document activities at Fort Meridian without influencing normal patterns of behavior among personnel under investigation. The Admission transformed the entire context of the interview. Suddenly, Maya wasn't a junior officer who had somehow overpowered a superior during a training incident. She was a highly trained operative who had been conducting surveillance on the entire base while maintaining a perfect facade of unremarkable competence. Colonel Reeves struggled to process the implications. And your combat skills, the way you neutralized Commander Blake, are consistent with my actual training background, Maya replied, which includes specialized instruction in close-quarters combat, defensive tactics, and restraint techniques designed for situations where traditional military hierarchy might be compromised by hostile or inappropriate behavior. Jesus Christ, Major Kim muttered, earning a sharp look from Colonel Reeves. You're not infantry at all, are you? Maya's smile returned, the same cold, calculating expression that had preceded Blake's downfall. Major, my actual military occupational specialty requires security clearances that take years to obtain and congressional oversight to modify. What I can tell you is that my training includes capabilities that are not reflected in standard Army personnel. Documentation. The sound of approaching vehicles in the parking lot outside interrupted the interview. Through the small window in the interview room door, they could see black SUVs with government plates pulling up to the headquarters building. Men and women in civilian clothes were already moving toward the entrance with the purposeful stride of people operating under federal authority. That would be General Morrison's team, Maya observed, checking her watch with the casual precision of someone whose sense of timing had been honed through years of operational experience. Right on schedule. Colonel Reeves stood up, her expression showing the mixture of frustration and curiosity that senior officers experience when they discover that events at their command have been orchestrated by authorities operating well above their clearance level. Lieutenant Chen, she said formally, it appears that this interview is about to be elevated beyond my jurisdiction. Before that happens, I need to ask you directly, is Fort Meridian under some kind of federal investigation? Maya's response was delivered with the kind of respectful directness that suggested she had genuine respect for Colonel Reeves' position, even while acknowledging that larger forces were now at play. Ma'am, what I can tell you is that the investigation you're about to become part of extends far beyond Fort Meridian and involves patterns of behavior that have been systematically documented across multiple military installations. Commander Blake's assault today was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a much larger pattern that finally provided the evidence necessary to begin formal proceedings. The door to the interview room opened, and a woman in an expensive dark suit entered with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to wielding significant authority. She was followed by two men whose posture and positioning marked them clearly as professional security personnel. Colonel Reeves, Major Kim, the woman said, producing credentials that identified her as General Patricia Morrison, exactly as Maya had predicted. I'll be taking custody of Lieutenant Chen and assuming control of this investigation under federal authority. Thank you for your cooperation in maintaining security until our arrival. As Maya stood to accompany General Morrison, she turned back to the two investigators who had spent the last hour discovering that nothing about their base was quite what they had believed it to be. Colonel. Major, Maya said with a slight nod of respect, I want you to know that your conduct during this interview has been exemplary. The professionalism you've shown will be noted in my final report. And with that, Lieutenant Maya Chen, whoever she really was, walked out of the interview room and into a larger world of federal investigation and classified operations, leaving behind two very confused officers and a base full of soldiers who were about to discover that their quiet, unremarkable colleague had been someone else entirely. The secure briefing room in Fort Meridian's classified operations wing had been sealed and swept for surveillance devices twice in the past hour. General Patricia Morrison sat at the head of a polished conference table, flanked by personnel whose credentials suggested they operated at the highest levels of military, intelligence, and federal law enforcement. Across from them, Colonel Reeves and Major Kim represented Fort Meridian's leadership, while Maya occupied a chair that seemed to symbolically bridge the gap between the base's routine operations and the shadowy world of federal investigation that had suddenly materialized around them. "Before we begin," General Morrison announced, activating recording equipment that was clearly more sophisticated than anything Fort Meridian typically used. "I need to establish that everything discussed in this briefing is classified at the Special Access Program level. Unauthorized disclosure carries penalties up to and including federal prosecution under the Espionage Act." The gravity of the statement settled over the room like a physical weight. Colonel Reeves had commanded Fort Meridian for 3 years and held security clearances that allowed her access to most classified military operations. But she had never been involved in anything requiring the level of secrecy that General Morrison was describing. General Morrison opened a thick folder and removed a photograph that she placed on the table, where everyone could see it clearly. The image showed Maya, but not as anyone at Fort Meridian had ever seen her. Instead of the unremarkable Lieutenant Chen in standard Army fatigues, the photograph depicted someone in specialized tactical gear, carrying equipment that suggested capabilities far beyond routine military operations. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Morrison began, "I'd like you to meet Captain Maya Elizabeth Chen, United States Army Special Operations Command, currently serving as a deep cover investigative specialist with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office." The revelation hit the room like a detonation. Major Kim's pen clattered to the table as he stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the image of a highly trained special operations officer with the quiet, unassuming lieutenant who had spent 18 months blending seamlessly into Fort Meridian's routine operations. "Captain," Colonel Reeves managed, her voice betraying the confusion of someone whose understanding of military hierarchy had just been fundamentally challenged. "But her service record shows exactly what we designed it to show," General Morrison interrupted smoothly. "Captain Chen's actual background includes graduation from West Point with highest honors, selection for the Army's most elite special operations programs, and specialized training in deep cover investigation techniques that are used when traditional oversight mechanisms have proven inadequate." Maya, now revealed as Captain Chen, spoke for the first time since entering the briefing room, her voice carrying the confidence and authority that she had been carefully concealing for the past year and a half. The Lieutenant Chen identity was created specifically to investigate allegations of systematic misconduct at Fort Meridian that required long-term observation and documentation. From within the affected units, General Morrison nodded and removed additional documents from her folder. 18 months ago, the Inspector General's office received credible allegations that Fort Meridian was experiencing patterns of harassment, assault, and abuse of authority that were being systematically covered up by command personnel. Traditional investigations had been unsuccessful because the perpetrators had learned to modify their behavior when outside observers were present. The implications were staggering. Colonel Reeves realized that every interaction she had observed between Maya and other personnel, every evaluation and report, every seemingly routine administrative decision had actually been part of a carefully orchestrated investigation that had been documenting the culture and conduct of her entire command. So when Lieutenant Captain Chen helped Private Mitchell during the exercise, Major Kim said slowly, when she defended her tactical decisions to Commander Blake, when she demonstrated that professional composure under pressure, She was performing exactly as trained, General Morrison confirmed. Captain Chun's operational specialty includes maintaining cover identities while documenting patterns of misconduct that might not be visible during routine inspections or formal investigations. Her mission required her to experience and observe the daily reality of life at Fort Meridian from the perspective of a junior officer who might be vulnerable to the kinds of abuse that had been reported. Maya leaned forward slightly, her demeanor now completely transformed from the deferential junior officer persona she had maintained for so long. The investigation has documented 127 instances of inappropriate conduct by command personnel over the past 18 months, ranging from verbal harassment to physical assault. Commander Blake's behavior today was consistent with patterns we've observed repeatedly. But it was the first time his actions escalated to the level where immediate intervention was necessary. Colonel Reeves felt a chill as she began to understand the scope of what Maya was describing. You're saying that Blake's assault against you was just one example of behavior that's been occurring regularly at my base? Ma'am, Maya replied with respectful directness. Our investigation has identified systematic failures in reporting mechanisms, retaliation against personnel who attempt to file complaints, and a culture of intimidation that has prevented victims from seeking appropriate remedies through official channels. Commander Blake was not an isolated case. He was representative of institutional problems that have been allowed to persist and flourish. General Morrison removed another set of documents and spread them across the table. These are preliminary findings from Captain Chun's investigation, cross-referenced with independent reports from other sources. The pattern of misconduct at Fort Meridian extends beyond individual bad actors to include systematic failures of leadership, oversight, and accountability. The documents contained names, dates, detailed incident reports, and photographic evidence that painted a damning picture of institutional dysfunction. Major Kim recognized many of the individuals mentioned in the reports, including senior officers whose reputations he had never questioned. The scope of this investigation extends beyond Fort Meridian, General Morrison continued. We have reason to believe that similar patterns exist at multiple installations, and that there may be coordination between perpetrators to share information about avoiding detection and consequences. Maya's expression hardened as she addressed this larger context. What we've discovered suggests that certain individuals have developed sophisticated methods for identifying and targeting vulnerable personnel while protecting themselves through manipulation of official reporting systems. The network appears to include personnel at various ranks and positions who collaborate to shield each other from accountability. Colonel Reeves struggled to process the magnitude of what she was hearing. Are you telling me that there's been an organized conspiracy operating within my command structure? We're telling you that systematic abuse of authority has been enabled by institutional failures that may have been deliberately cultivated by individuals with interests in avoiding accountability. General Morrison replied carefully. The investigation is ongoing, but today's incident has provided us with the evidence necessary to begin formal proceedings against multiple personnel. Maya reached into her own folder and removed a device that looked like a standard military radio, but was clearly something more sophisticated. This equipment has been recording audio and transmitting data throughout my assignment at Fort Meridian. Every conversation, every interaction, every instance of misconduct has been documented and preserved as evidence. The revelation that Maya had been essentially wearing surveillance equipment for 18 months while maintaining her cover identity added another layer of complexity to an already staggering situation. Major Kim realized that conversations he had witnessed, interactions he had considered routine, and behaviors he had dismissed as normal military culture had all been recorded and analyzed as potential evidence of criminal misconduct. The combative skills you displayed against Commander Blake Colonel Reeves said, finally beginning to understand the full scope of Maya's deception. Those were part of your actual training as a special operations officer? Maya's smile returned, but now it carried the confidence of someone whose true capabilities were finally being acknowledged. My actual training includes advanced close-quarters combat, psychological operations, surveillance techniques, and specialized skills for operating in hostile environments while maintaining cover identities. The defensive tactics I used against Commander Blake represent basic level application of techniques designed for much more challenging operational scenarios. General Morrison checked her watch and began gathering the documents spread across the table. Captain Chun's mission at Fort Meridian is now concluded. Beginning tomorrow, federal marshals will begin executing arrest warrants for personnel identified during the investigation. Additional investigative teams will be arriving to conduct formal interviews with potential witnesses and victims. The transformation was complete. In the space of a few hours, Lieutenant Maya Chen, the quiet, unremarkable officer whom everyone had dismissed as harmless, had been revealed as Captain Maya Chen, a highly trained special operations investigator whose 18-month assignment had gathered evidence that would destroy careers, result in criminal prosecutions, and fundamentally reshape the culture of one of the Army's premier training installations. As the briefing concluded, and the participants prepared to leave, Maya approached Colonel Reeves with an expression of genuine respect. "Ma'am, I want you to know that this investigation was never about questioning your leadership or integrity. The institutional problems we've documented existed long before your command, and your cooperation today has demonstrated the kind of professionalism that gives me hope for the changes that are coming." Colonel Reeves nodded, though her expression showed the strain of someone whose world had been fundamentally altered in ways she was still struggling to comprehend. "Captain Chun," she said formally, "I have to ask, during these 18 months, did you ever doubt whether you were doing the right thing?" Maya's response carried the weight of someone who had spent over a year watching injustice, while being unable to intervene directly. "Every single day, ma'am. But that's exactly why this investigation was necessary." The federal arrests began at dawn the following Tuesday, exactly 72 hours after Commander Blake's assault on the firing range. Maya stood in the observation tower overlooking Fort Meridian's main parade ground, no longer wearing the unremarkable fatigues of Lieutenant Chun, but dressed in the crisp uniform of a captain with ribbons that told the story of a distinguished special operations career. Beside her, General Morrison watched through binoculars as teams of federal marshals moved with military precision through the base, executing warrants that would dismantle a network of corruption that had operated with impunity for over a decade. 17 arrests so far, General Morrison reported as another black SUV departed the base with personnel who would never return to active duty, including 3 full colonels, 8 majors, and personnel from installations in Texas, Georgia, and North Carolina who were part of Blake's network. Maya nodded, her expression showing neither satisfaction nor regret as she watched careers end and lives fundamentally change. The investigation had revealed connections that extended far beyond Fort Meridian, involving a sophisticated system of personnel transfers, favorable evaluations, and coordinated cover-ups that had allowed predatory behavior to flourish across multiple military installations. Blake himself? Maya asked, though she already knew the answer from the morning briefing reports. Federal custody since yesterday evening. His attorney is suggesting he might be willing to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges. But the evidence Captain Chun gathered makes cooperation somewhat redundant. General Morrison lowered her binoculars and turned to study Maya's profile. 18 months of deep cover investigation. How are you processing the conclusion of this mission? It was a question that Maya had been asking herself since the moment Blake's hand had struck her face and triggered the final sequence of events that would define her military career. For over a year, she had lived as someone else, suppressing her training and instincts while watching behavior that violated every principle she had sworn to uphold when she accepted her commission as an Army officer, General. If I'm being completely honest, part of me wishes it could have ended differently. Blake was a decorated combat veteran with 30 years of service. The waste of that experience, the betrayal of everything the uniform represents, it's difficult to reconcile. General. Morrison's expression showed understanding mixed with the pragmatic acceptance of someone who had overseen numerous investigations into institutional failures. Captain, you've seen the files on Blake's victims. 17 female soldiers whose careers were derailed by his harassment and abuse. 3 who left the military entirely rather than continue serving under his command. 1 who attempted suicide after filing a complaint that was buried by his network of protection. Maya's jaw tightened as she remembered the faces and stories that had motivated her mission from the beginning. Private Sarah Martinez, who had transferred to another base after Blake's mentoring had become increasingly inappropriate. Lieutenant Amanda Foster, whose negative evaluation from Blake had destroyed her chances for promotion despite stellar performance in every other assessment. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Wong, who had filed harassment complaints that had mysteriously disappeared from official records while Blake's supporters questioned her credibility and mental stability. The network was more sophisticated than we initially realized, Maya said, consulting notes from the federal investigation that had expanded exponentially since Blake's arrest. Personnel records show that Blake and his associates had developed a system for identifying and targeting specific types of soldiers, typically women from disadvantaged backgrounds who lacked family connections or political influence that might protect them. The methodical nature of the predatory behavior had been one of the most disturbing discoveries of Maya's investigation. Blake hadn't been engaging in random harassment or opportunistic abuse of authority. Instead, he had been part of a calculated system that identified vulnerable personnel and systematically exploited their positions within military hierarchy to avoid accountability. General. Morrison handed Maya a thick folder containing preliminary reports from the expanded federal investigation. The pattern extends to at least 6 military installations, with evidence suggesting coordination between perpetrators to share tactics and warning systems. When investigators began closing in at one base, personnel would transfer to positions at other installations where they could continue their behavior. Maya opened the folder and found herself looking at organizational charts that map relationships between Blake and associates stationed across the country. The conspiracy had included personnel in key administrative positions who could manipulate transfer orders, evaluation reports, and disciplinary records to protect members of their network, while targeting individuals who pose potential threats to their operations. Captain, General Morrison continued, your investigation didn't just expose individual misconduct, it revealed systematic institutional failures that have been enabling organized predatory behavior within the United States military. The implications for military justice and personnel management are profound. The weight of that responsibility was something Maya had been carrying throughout her 18 months of deep cover work. Every day that she had maintained her facade as the unremarkable Lieutenant Chen, she had been gathering evidence that would ultimately impact thousands of military personnel and fundamentally change policies governing conduct and accountability within the armed forces. The personal cost, Maya said quietly, watching as another vehicle departed with personnel whose lives would never be the same, has been significant for everyone involved. Not just the perpetrators, but their families, their units, the soldiers who believed in them, and are now questioning everything they thought they understood. about military leadership. General Morrison's expression showed genuine empathy for the complexity of Maya's position. Captain, you spent over a year watching injustice while being unable to intervene directly, except in the most extreme circumstances. That kind of sustained psychological pressure would challenge even the most experienced operatives. Maya thought about Private Mitchell, the young soldier whose twisted ankle during the urban warfare exercise had provided the first opportunity for her to subtly demonstrate capabilities beyond her supposed training level. Mitchell had been exactly the kind of vulnerable personnel that Blake's network typically targeted: young, female, from a disadvantaged background, and lacking the connections that might provide protection from harassment. The hardest part, Maya admitted, was maintaining the Lieutenant Chen persona while watching behavior that I knew was wrong but couldn't address without compromising the investigation. There were nights when I questioned whether gathering evidence was worth allowing the continued victimization of personnel under my observation. And what conclusion did you reach? General Morrison asked. Maya's response reflected the kind of moral clarity that had driven her to accept the deep cover assignment despite its personal costs. That the only way to permanently stop systematic abuse was to gather evidence comprehensive enough to dismantle the entire network. Individual interventions might have protected specific victims, but they would have allowed the larger pattern to continue and evolve. The federal investigation had vindicated that assessment. Blake's arrest had triggered a cascade of revelations that exposed corruption reaching into the highest levels of military administration at multiple installations. Personnel who had considered themselves untouchable were discovering that their years of careful networking and mutual protection had created a paper trail that federal investigators could follow with devastating precision. Your mission performance evaluation, General Morrison said, handing Maya another document, reflects the assessment that your 18-month investigation represents one of the most successful deep cover operations in the history of military law enforcement. The evidence you gathered has already resulted in policy changes that will affect personnel management across all branches of the armed forces. Maya accepted the evaluation but didn't immediately read it. Instead, she continued watching the base below as normal operations resumed around the extraordinary events that had transformed Fort Meridian overnight. Soldiers were conducting routine training exercises. Administrative personnel were processing the paperwork that kept military bureaucracy functioning. And life was adapting to the absence of individuals whose influence had shaped the culture of the installation for years. General, Maya said finally, what happens to the personnel who were victimized by Blake's network? The soldiers whose careers were damaged, whose faith in military justice was destroyed, whose trust in the institution was violated. General Morrison's response reflected years of experience dealing with the aftermath of institutional failures. That, Captain, is why your mission was so important. Justice delayed is justice denied. But justice achieved through comprehensive investigation provides the foundation for genuine institutional change. The evidence you gathered doesn't just punish wrongdoers, it validates the experiences of their victims and creates precedents that will protect future personnel. As the morning progressed and the scope of the federal response became clear to everyone at Fort Meridian, Maya began the psychological transition from deep cover operative back to her actual identity as Captain Maya Chen. The transformation would require time and professional support, but she carried the satisfaction of knowing that her sacrifice had achieved something meaningful and lasting. The quiet, unremarkable Lieutenant Chen was gone forever, but Captain Maya Chen was ready to continue serving her country with the knowledge that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with patience, courage, and an unwavering commitment to justice. That the transformation in how Fort Meridian's personnel viewed Maya became evident within hours of the federal arrests. Soldiers who had dismissed her as unremarkable or even weak now approached her with a mixture of awe, respect, and profound confusion about how thoroughly she had deceived everyone around her. The mess hall conversations, barracks discussions, and training ground interactions all centered around the same incredulous question: how had someone with such extraordinary capabilities hidden in plain sight for 18 months? Sergeant Rodriguez, who had joked about Maya being destined for a career pushing papers, found himself assigned to provide Captain Chen with a formal briefing on Alpha Company's performance metrics. As he stood at attention in front of the woman he had once dismissed as ineffectual, his voice betrayed the discomfort of someone whose worldview had been fundamentally challenged. "Ma'am," Rodriguez began, consulting notes that trembled slightly in his hands, "Alpha Company has maintained readiness ratings of 87% throughout the evaluation period, with particular strengths in tactical coordination and weapons proficiency. However, our personnel retention has been problematic." Maya, now wearing captain's bars and ribbons that told the story of a distinguished special operations career, listened with the kind of focused attention that made Rodriguez increasingly aware of how much he had underestimated her capabilities during their previous interactions. "Sergeant, when you say problematic, are you referring to the pattern of female soldiers requesting transfers to other installations?" Maya's question was delivered with professional neutrality, but Rodriguez understood that she already knew the answer and was testing his willingness to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. "Yes, ma'am. In the past 18 months, we've had 12 female soldiers transfer out of Alpha Company, citing personal reasons or career development opportunities. At the time, leadership attributed this to normal personnel rotation. But in light of recent events," Rodriguez's voice trailed off as he realized he was discussing patterns that Captain Chen had been systematically documenting throughout her deep cover assignment. Every transfer request, every personnel evaluation, every complaint that had been dismissed or buried, all of it had been observed and recorded by the quiet lieutenant they had all underestimated. Private Sarah Mitchell, whose ankle injury during the urban warfare exercise had prompted Maya's first subtle intervention, requested a meeting with Captain Chen to express gratitude and seek guidance about her military career. The young soldier's perspective on recent events illustrated how dramatically the revelation had impacted personnel throughout the base. "Ma'am," Mitchell said, her voice reflecting the mixture of gratitude and amazement that had become common among Fort Meridian's junior personnel, "I need you to know that when you helped me during that exercise, when you modified our formation to accommodate my injury that probably saved my career. If I had been forced to report the ankle problem, Commander Blake would have used it to justify a negative evaluation that could have followed me for years." Maya's response revealed the careful calculation that had gone into even seemingly spontaneous acts of assistance during her mission. "Private Mitchell, your injury presented an opportunity to observe how command personnel responded to vulnerability among their subordinates. The way you were willing to risk further harm rather than admit weakness reflected a culture where showing any limitation could be weaponized against you." Mitchell nodded, her understanding of military dynamics having been shaped by 18 months of serving under Blake's command. "Ma'am, how many of us knew? I mean, how many soldiers suspected that you weren't actually just a regular lieutenant?" "Very few," Maya admitted. "Master Sergeant Chen, no." Relation mentioned after yesterday's arrests that he had noticed inconsistencies in my reactions during high-stress situations. Technical Sergeant Anderson from the communications unit said that my familiarity with encrypted radio protocols seemed unusual for an infantry officer. But the cover identity was designed to be convincing to anyone without specialized training in counterintelligence. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Williams from the Judge Advocate General's office, who had been assigned to coordinate with federal investigators regarding ongoing legal proceedings. His expression showed the strain of someone dealing with legal complexities that extended far beyond routine military justice issues. "Captain Chen," Williams said, consulting a tablet filled with case files and legal documents, "I need to brief you on the current status of proceedings against personnel from Blake's network. Federal prosecutors are preparing cases against 17 individuals, with charges ranging from assault and harassment to conspiracy and abuse of authority under the Uniform Code of Military Justice." Maya's attention focused immediately on the legal implications of her 18 months of evidence gathering. "Captain Williams, what's the prosecution's assessment of the evidentiary foundation we've provided?" Williams's response reflected both professional admiration and personal amazement at the scope of Maya's documentation efforts. "Captain, in 30 years of military legal practice, I've never seen such comprehensive evidence collection in a criminal case. The audio recordings, photographic documentation, and detailed incident reports you compiled have created an evidentiary record that makes denial or deflection virtually impossible for the accused." The conversation was joined by Colonel Reeves, whose leadership of Fort Meridian had been vindicated by the investigation, but who continued to struggle with the implications of systematic misconduct that had occurred under her command. Her approach to Maya reflected the complex mixture of gratitude and professional confusion that characterized many senior officers' responses to the revelation. "Captain Chen," Colonel Reeves said, her voice carrying the weight of someone grappling with institutional failures she had been unaware of despite her position of authority, "I need to understand how extensively this investigation has documented problems in our command structure. Are there other personnel who should be concerned about their conduct during the evaluation period?" Maya's response demonstrated the careful distinction between systematic predatory behavior and routine military leadership challenges. "Ma'am, the investigation focused specifically on patterns of harassment, abuse of authority, and conspiracy to cover up misconduct. Personnel who maintained professional standards and treated subordinates with appropriate respect have nothing to fear from the federal inquiry." The distinction provided some relief to Colonel Reeves, but also highlighted the sophisticated nature of the network that Maya had been investigating. The perpetrators hadn't been engaging in obvious or widespread misconduct that would have been easily detected by routine oversight. Instead, they had operated through careful target selection, psychological manipulation, and systematic exploitation of institutional blind spots that allowed their behavior to continue undetected. "The ripple effects," Colonel Reeves continued, "extend beyond the individuals who have been arrested. Soldiers throughout Fort Meridian are questioning their understanding of leadership, authority, and institutional accountability. Some are expressing anger that problems existed for so long without being addressed through normal channels." Maya's response reflected her deep understanding of military culture and the challenges inherent in addressing institutional dysfunction within hierarchical organizations. "Ma'am, the anger is justified and healthy. It represents soldiers' recognition that the standards they've been taught to uphold weren't being consistently applied to personnel in positions of authority. The investigation has validated their instincts about behavior that they knew was wrong but felt powerless to address." Captain Williams added his perspective from the legal proceedings that would determine the ultimate consequences for Blake's network. "The federal prosecutors have emphasized that this case represents an opportunity to send a clear message about accountability and institutional integrity. The sentences being sought reflect the serious nature of violations of trust that occurred." As the day progressed and more personnel learned details about Maya's actual background and mission, a pattern emerged in their responses that reflected the profound impact of her 18-month deception. Soldiers who had considered themselves experienced In reading people and situations were forced to confront how completely they had misjudged someone operating at the highest levels of military professionalism. Staff Sergeant Morrison, Blake's former right-hand man who had been present during the firing range confrontation, approached Maya with the demeanor of someone seeking to understand how thoroughly his loyalty had been misplaced. His conversation with her illustrated the psychological impact on personnel who had unknowingly supported institutional dysfunction. "Captain," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of someone reassessing years of professional relationships, "I need to ask directly, how long have you known about the extent of Commander Blake's misconduct? And why didn't anyone try to warn personnel like me about what we were supporting?" Maya's answer reflected both empathy for Morrison's position and firm commitment to the investigative methods that had been necessary to achieve comprehensive results. "Staff Sergeant, the investigation required observing authentic behavior patterns without external influence. Warning you about Blake's conduct would have changed how you interacted with him, potentially allowing the network to detect our investigation and modify their operations. The mission required accepting short-term moral complexity to achieve long-term justice." Morrison nodded, though his expression showed the difficulty of accepting that 18 months of his professional life had been spent supporting someone whose behavior had violated everything he thought military leadership represented. "Ma'am," he said finally, "I want you to know that personnel like me who got caught up in Blake's operation were grateful that someone with your capabilities was watching and documenting what was really happening, even if it took 18 months to resolve." The conversation captured the broader transformation occurring throughout Fort Meridian as personnel grappled with the revelation that their quiet, unremarkable colleague had actually been one of the most highly trained investigators in the United States military, conducting an operation that would reshape military justice and institutional accountability for years to come. 6 months after the arrests at Fort Meridian, Captain Maya Chen stood in the Pentagon's E-Ring, briefing a room full of senior military leaders on the systemic reforms that had emerged from her 18-month deep cover investigation. The sterile conference room was filled with generals, admirals, and civilian defense officials who had gathered to review the comprehensive changes to military personnel policies that had been implemented across all service branches as a direct result of her documented findings. The Meridian Protocols, as they had come to be known throughout the Department of Defense, represented the most significant overhaul of military harassment and abuse reporting systems in decades. Maya's evidence had provided the foundation for new oversight mechanisms, mandatory training programs, and accountability measures that were already showing measurable results in protecting vulnerable personnel across the armed forces. General Morrison, who had overseen the federal investigation, was now directing the implementation of these reforms from her position as Deputy Secretary of Defense. Her introduction of Maya to the assembled leadership reflected the recognition that the young captain's work had achieved institutional change that traditional oversight methods had failed to accomplish. Captain Chen's investigation didn't just expose individual misconduct, General Morrison explained to the room. It revealed systematic vulnerabilities in our personnel management systems that had been exploited by organized networks of predatory behavior. The reforms we've implemented address not just the symptoms we observed at Fort Meridian, but the institutional blind spots that allowed such networks to operate with impunity. Maya approached the podium with the confidence of someone whose work had been validated at the highest levels of military leadership. The quiet, unassuming Lieutenant Chen persona was now completely gone, replaced by a special operations officer whose expertise in institutional investigation had earned respect throughout the defense establishment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Maya began, activating a presentation that displayed statistical data from military installations worldwide. The implementation of enhanced reporting protocols has resulted in a 340% increase in harassment complaints filed through official channels in the past 6 months. Critically, our analysis indicates that this increase represents improved reporting of existing problems rather than an actual rise in misconduct incidents. The data supported Maya's assessment that her investigation had identified problems that were far more widespread than anyone had previously realized. By providing personnel with reporting mechanisms that bypass potentially compromised local command structures, the new protocols had revealed a landscape of institutional dysfunction that demanded comprehensive response. The anonymous reporting systems, Maya continued, have been particularly effective in identifying coordinated misconduct across multiple installations. We've documented 17 separate networks similar to the one operated by Blake and his associates, involving over 200 personnel who had developed sophisticated methods for avoiding detection and accountability. Admiral Richardson, Chief of Naval Operations, leaned forward as he studied the geographical distribution of the networks Maya had mapped. Captain Chen, are you suggesting that the Fort Meridian investigation was just the tip of the iceberg in terms of systematic abuse within our military culture? Maya's response reflected the sobering reality that her deep cover mission had uncovered. Sir, our analysis indicates that the behaviors documented at Fort Meridian were representative of problems that existed throughout the military establishment. The difference was that Blake's network had become sufficiently confident and systematic in their operations to create the kind of evidence trail that our investigation could follow and document comprehensively. The room fell silent as the assembled leadership processed the implications of Maya's assessment. General Patterson, Army Chief of Staff, was the first to voice the question that everyone was considering. Captain, based on your analysis of these networks and their operational methods, what's your assessment of how long these problems have existed without adequate institutional response? Maya consulted her notes, though the answer was one she had been preparing for months as the scope of the investigation had continued to expand. Sir, our evidence suggests that organized predatory behavior within military hierarchies has been evolving and adapting for at least 15 years, with the most sophisticated networks developing around 2010 as social media and digital communication provided new tools for coordination and victim identification. The timeline corresponded with personnel records that showed certain individuals moving between installations in patterns that seemed designed to avoid accountability while maintaining access to vulnerable personnel. Maya's investigation had revealed that the networks had learned to exploit the military's emphasis on loyalty and chain of command to silence victims and protect perpetrators. The psychological impact on victims, Maya continued, advancing to slides that displayed survey data from personnel who had experienced harassment within military settings, extends far beyond individual trauma to include loss of faith in institutional justice and systematic avoidance of military careers by qualified personnel who feared they would be unable to protect themselves within existing command structures. Secretary of Defense Martinez, who had personally authorized Maya's mission and overseen the implementation of reforms based on her findings, addressed the room with the gravity of someone whose department was undergoing fundamental transformation. The costs of allowing these networks to operate, Martinez said, included not just the direct harm to victims, but the broader degradation of military effectiveness through loss of talented personnel and erosion of trust in leadership. Captain Chen's investigation has provided us with the evidence and analysis necessary to address institutional problems that we should have confronted decades ago. Maya's presentation concluded with recommendations for ongoing oversight and prevention measures that would ensure the reforms implemented in response to her investigation would continue to evolve and improve. But as the formal briefing ended and the assembled leadership began discussing implementation details, Maya found herself reflecting on the personal journey that had brought her to this moment. The 18 months she had spent as Lieutenant Chen had changed her in ways that extended far beyond professional development. Living with a false identity while observing injustice had tested her psychological resilience and forced her to confront fundamental questions about the nature of duty, sacrifice, and institutional loyalty. General Morrison approached Maya as the conference room began to empty. "Captain, I understand you've requested reassignment to operational duties rather than continuing with investigative work. Are you certain that's the direction you want for your career?" Maya's response reflected careful consideration of how her experience had shaped her understanding of where she could best serve her country. "General, the investigation at Fort Meridian taught me that the most important battles aren't always fought on traditional battlefields. But it also confirmed that my training and temperament are best suited for direct operational roles rather than long-term undercover work, and the psychological impact of maintaining a false identity for such an extended period," Morrison asked with the concern of someone who understood the personal costs of deep cover operations. "Has been significant," Maya admitted. "The transition back to my actual identity required professional counseling and extensive debriefing to process the experience of watching injustice while being unable to intervene directly except in extreme circumstances. But the knowledge that the mission achieved meaningful institutional change has provided the psychological framework necessary for moving forward." 3 weeks later, Captain Maya Chen reported to Fort Bragg for assignment to the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, where her skills would be applied to counter-terrorism operations that aligned more closely with her original career aspirations. Her personnel file now reflected her actual training and capabilities, though certain details of her investigative work remained classified at levels requiring presidential authorization for disclosure. On her final day at the Pentagon, Maya received a package with no return address. Inside was a small plastic F-16 fighter jet, not the toy that Tommy Rodriguez had given to Lieutenant Chen, but a similar model that carried a simple note: "Thank you for proving that heroes don't always wear capes. They sometimes wear the same uniform as everyone else, but with courage that makes all the difference." A grateful soldier, Maya placed the toy aircraft on her desk at Fort Bragg, where it served as a daily reminder that the most important victories often come not from dramatic heroic actions, but from the patient, persistent work of people who are willing to sacrifice their own comfort and recognition to protect others and uphold the principles they have sworn to defend. The quiet, unremarkable Lieutenant Chen was gone forever, her mission complete and her impact permanent. Captain Maya Chen was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, carrying the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one that everyone underestimates, and that true strength often lies not in avoiding conflict, but in knowing exactly when and how to stand up for what is right. Regardless of the personal cost, the story would be told and retold throughout military circles for years to come, becoming part of the institutional memory that would help future personnel recognize that appearances can be deceiving, that justice sometimes requires patience and sacrifice, and that the most important battles are often fought by people whose names never appear in headlines, but whose actions change the world in ways that matter forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.